What's the eeriest thing you've ever encountered out on the water? We were cruising in the Bahamas one night in the Devil's Triangle. All of a sudden, we hear this chain dragging down the hull for like a minute, just scraping. It was unnerving, and it was an exuma sound, which is like thousands of feet deep. That means it would have been floating and hanging off the bottom of something, maybe like an old mine drifting for years. We turned around to try and find it, but we could never spot it again. It just disappeared. Another time, we were under the polar ice cap, and the ice sheet moans all the time, like what you'd imagine a mermaid siren would sound like. And sometimes you can hear it through the hull for about 65 days straight, nonstop. The North Pole is absolutely the quietest place you can ever be. In November, it has this fog that's always there, and you can't tell how far away anything is. It gets very unnerving after a while. We responded to a sailboat that was taking on water. It became clear that the sailboat wasn't going to make it. We brought the crew of the sailboat onto our vessel, and then we just sort of waited around, watching the sailboat sink. What struck me was how silent it was. No fuss, no drama. It wasn't like a dark and stormy night or anything, just a picture-perfect day. Glassy ocean, not a cloud in the sky, and it didn't matter. It was the kind of day most seafarers dream about, yet these guys had been in a fight for their lives trying to keep their boat afloat. After it sank, there were a few bubbles, and then that was it. You'd have never known there was ever a sailboat there. Just a beautiful day, without a trace of struggle. Sailboat? What sailboat? Around here, I didn't see a sailboat. I was on a night dive. It was a dive site I was familiar with. And as is common practice, the captain had fixed a steady strobe light to the anchor line of the boat so we could find our way back. As I was readying to complete my dive and ascend, I wondered why the strobe was no longer blinking and had become just a steady beam. Looking at my compass, I was doubly confused by how I had gotten my navigation so wrong. I felt foolish. Had I been cocky and overexcited because I was comfortable with this sight? How could I have miscalculated my direction so badly? It's a dangerous mistake at any time for a diver, much more so at night. But as I was ascending, the brightness of the light really started to bother me. Why would the captain change the strobe on us? Was something wrong? Then it hit me. I wasn't swimming toward the boat at all. I was swimming toward the moon. The water was so clear and calm, I had mistaken it for a light. Luckily, I hadn't ascended fully and wasn't too far off. I was able to redirect to my original navigation, eventually finding the strobe, the boat, and a renewed respect for the ocean's ability to make you second-guess yourself. Weirdest thing I've seen by far is coming out of a fog bank and seeing thousands of giant red Humboldt squid with their tentacles waving in the air. It was surreal and something I will never forget, like a bunch of little aliens. I saw something that appeared very serpentine and very huge, undulating in the waves of our wake on a very dark, cloudy night en route from Florida to NYC. It was glowing faintly green just underneath the surface and appeared to be some sort of huge, fat snake swimming alongside us with a 1.5-foot diameter body. It was mesmerizing, trying to rationalize what I was looking at. Later, I realized it was just a dolphin playing in our wake, whose undulating body and wake were lit up by bioluminescent plankton. Research vessel in the early 90s, about 200 miles off South Carolina. We could hold position within a few dozen meters using a satellite system, predates GPS, so we stayed parked for days at a time. Sargasso seaweed would drift past us on its way to Europe. One time, the bridge called out an oil slick that turned out to be a pod of killer whales drifting past, about half a mile off the port side. Before the slick came alongside, 2 whales came over and patrolled stem to stern, maybe 30 feet off the port rail, while the rest of the pod stayed with their kill. When the kill was even with us, 2 more whales came and patrolled with the first 2, taking 2 complete laps altogether. Then the first 2 left to rejoin the lunch party, while the new squad stayed with us. After a while, those 2 left, and we never saw any of them again. At no time did they go to the starboard side, and they never went far beyond the ends of our ship. It was an organized guard patrol. Their message was very clear, and no one denied that we had been warned off. We never did figure out what was on the menu, but it was large enough to form a huge oil slick. Another ship that was miles away looked like you could reach out and touch it. It's an optical phenomenon I've seen many times, to varying degrees. A school of thousands of hammerhead sharks all swimming in the same direction. A whale swimming along that was half eaten. Being in storms where seas were tall, and thinking back on wooden ships in the past, traversing through such storms always weirded me out a bit. We were around some islands in the South Pacific. Saw a guy, one lone dude, floating in the middle of the water on some kind of inner tube or life ring. He hailed us and asked us to stop and bring him aboard because he'd been shipwrecked. Our captain, having not been born yesterday, offered to throw him a rope instead. "We will happily tow you over to the open water and then welcome you aboard." The guy scowled and just said, "Never mind then." Don't stop around islands in pirated waters, folks. Submariner here. I was a sonar technician, and we were out on a mission with the towed arrays out. We were deep and picked up a couple of bios like shrimp and whales. It was quiet for about 20 minutes after we passed them. All of a sudden, we heard a screeching noise like metal on metal. We thought we had run into another sub. The whole boat went into battle stations and woke up our SME riders to determine what it was. This went on for about 5 minutes, just in and out. It sounded like a song when you started to replay it. The whole thing was recorded, but neither the acting nor the sonar chief could determine what it was. A message was sent out when we went to PD, and the recording was sent to our squadron and ONI once we pulled in. I don't know what happened afterward, but apparently the Navy collects these types of recordings regularly. From what we can tell, it was close and almost as big as the boat. We couldn't tell if it was biological or another boat. No screw noises or disturbance in the water. And no, we didn't hit anything. I was working on a pearl boat for around 18 months in the Arafura Sea a few years ago, and one of my roles was keeping watch in the wheelhouse. Essentially, I made sure the boat was following the preset path on the navigation, and if it strayed, I turned manually to keep it within the course set. My watch was from 4 to 8 a.m. About 7 a.m., I noticed a white cube perhaps 200 meters port side. Hard to say with no point of reference, but it didn't show up on the nav/radar system we had that let you plot/recognize boats. It was also not bobbing up and down with the waves. It was just sitting there on the waterline in the distance. I got a better look at it with the binoculars, and it was strange seeing this white cube just sitting still there on the sea. It wasn't really hovering above it, but as the waves moved with the ocean, every now and then I could see the bottom of it, which is how I knew it was a cube. Again, it's hard to say without a point of reference at sea, but I'm guessing it was the size of a van. I'm purely going off how big things appear in the binoculars when looking at things I know the size of. The person who was following my shift came to drop me a coffee, and he saw it too, so I know it wasn't just me being tired. A few years later, I saw when the Tic Tac videos came out from the Pentagon, and some of the fighter pilots said they saw similar shaped objects floating in the sky. Neither terribly eerie nor technically at sea, but I was involved as crew sailing from Chicago to Mackinac Island on Lake Michigan, which is big enough that you can't see land if you're in the middle. It's a freshwater sea in some sense. The boat was, shall we say, not well maintained, so our lights were out and the GPS had packed it in, though there was a handheld if we needed it. The compass was also way off, so I had the guy with the GPS read our track off until I was set for where we needed to be. I looked up and spotted the North Star Polaris at a point in the rigging and just kept it there all night. I told the next watch to just sleep in since I was in the groove, and it was magical. We sailed a perfect course until dawn. TLDR, sailed a good course by the stars all night. A magical experience. Standing on the bridge watching the Mediterranean in 1996, probably 50 miles north of Tunisia, at 2 a.m., something came down from the sky in a streak and exploded. It was absolute daylight for a few seconds. It was bright enough that we were seriously concerned that a nuclear explosion had happened. It was probably just a big meteorite or something exploding, but it was something to see. Same year, we were doing very slow survey lines in the Med at 1.5 knots with absolutely nothing around us or on the radar, and a flare went off directly in front of us. We found out later that it was a submarine that had kindly included us in war games and was letting us know that we were dead. One of my first trips out on a West Coast trawler, I was in the wheelhouse, and although the weather wasn't bad, birds kept showing up and trying to sneak into the inner parts of the boat. Apparently, they try to get inside to shelter from storms. Later that night, I was almost hurled from my bunk and was told someone broke their neck from the same thing. Also, an overworked engineer was using a shop vac to handle water flooding. Being at sea reminds me of how many of our industries used to be extremely dangerous, and many still are, but you don't realize it until you're in it. I was regularly about 22 hours away from emergency services. If something bad happens, it's up to the others present whether you survive. I was constantly thinking about how if you fall into the ocean without a survival suit, it takes about 8 minutes for hypothermia to become critical, which is also shorter than many boats can turn around to try and get you. Not me, but my great-grandfather was one of the first Americans to fight in World War I, back in early 1915. The U.S. didn't officially get involved until late 1917, and didn't arrive in force until 1918. Since the U.S. wasn't officially involved in WOI yet, he walked about 50 miles from his cabin in eastern Kentucky, which was only recently demolished because of squatters, to catch a series of buses from Lexington, KY, to New York City, where he booked passage on an ocean liner to London. During the voyage across the Atlantic, he saw some rather unusual things. Among them were odd lights in a storm, and he discovered what he initially thought was a mermaid in the water, which actually turned out to be the remains of a sailor who had been thrown overboard in the storm. If he was ever identified, I do not know his name, and anyone on that ship is now almost certainly dead. The ship was also torpedoed by the Germans. Thankfully, only one torpedo barely hit the ship and did not fully explode, resulting in only a handful of injuries and no fatalities. There were also multiple reports of ghost sightings. Later, when he was in a much smaller vessel crossing the English Channel, they spotted what they initially thought was a German submarine, but upon closer inspection, it turned out to be a capsized boat with the remains of sailors. The bodies were so badly decomposed that they were more like a human stew than recognizable bodies. I was out at sea on an AOR, Auxiliary Oil Replenishment, essentially a merchant ship that supplies fuel and supplies to Navy ships. We were out in December in the North Atlantic, dealing with swells so large that the spray from the bow was hitting the windows of the bridge. The bridge is 6 decks up and 400 feet aft of the bow. As we plowed through the swells, the entire 27,000-ton ship groaned and shuddered with each impact. Suddenly, the watertight door alarm went off for the door leading from the cargo section to the deck. Taking on water through that hatch would have been very serious. Fortunately, the alarm was triggered because the ocean had removed the sensor, not because there was a problem with the door. I was a submariner. We got some new escape suits aboard and were running familiarization exercises while underway. The exercise involved opening the lower of the 2 escape hatches in the engine room and going into the escape trunk. It was intense just looking at the single upper hatch, knowing what was on the other side if things went wrong. If that wasn't enough, I was sleeping in my rack sometime after and had a dream about being in the escape trunk with someone closing and locking me inside while the upper hatch was about to open. I started punching the lower hatch and yelling, "Let me out!" When I woke up, the guy in the rack above me asked if I was okay because I was punching the ceiling of my rack. Lol. Other than that, spending any amount of time at test depth was pretty nerve-wracking. Sometimes the only way to tell if a repair was successful was to go deep. I have had friends who were stationed in Guam who all had stories. One of them was a friend who lived high up in some apartments that overlooked a harbor famous for deep-sea fishing tours. One day, he saw a small boat with a big catch, probably a 10 to 15 great white shark, that didn't fit on the boat, so they were trailing it. While he was watching from his balcony, he noticed a school of fish behind the carcass, which wasn't unusual, but this school of fish moved differently. He said it looked more like some kind of large tadpole. It kept darting toward the carcass, then swimming away, which is also typical school behavior. He thought the angle must be funny, but then the tadpole swam up to the shark, and suddenly the shark disappeared under the water. The boat that was trailing it stalled, as if it had dropped anchor from the aft and struggled before suddenly bobbing forward. Only the shark's head was left. They pulled it up, circled the area, and then left. Whatever got away with 80% of the carcass must have had a mouth at least 10 feet wide. He had heard of this, but never seen it himself. Nobody was surprised when he retold the story. Another friend had a more lighthearted story. Diving in Guam, there are a lot of bomb craters in the shallows. Barracuda hunt as a pack when young, but as adults are solitary and territorial. One popular diving site had Bob the Barracuda, who guarded those craters. Now, barracuda aren't dumb. They know you're spearfishing, which means easy food. They are actually quite inquisitive and fairly intelligent, like morays, but look like 6-foot silver torpedoes with terrifying teeth. People would bribe Bob with hot dogs. The local bait shops had 8 packs of Franks, and you'd bring one with you because Bob and other sea life loved hot dogs. Bob also was very stealthy. You wouldn't see him until he was right at your face mask. He expected hot dogs. My friend said one day he was out looking for fish, and Bob appeared out of nowhere, highly focused on his groin. I had forgotten that I had my hot dogs in a net bag between my legs. Let me tell you, I really moved slowly and carefully to get Bob his hot dogs because I wanted no misunderstanding. Not quite at sea. Long Island Sound. I was out fishing, and we were fishing along the bottom, which was about 40 feet down or so. This was years ago, so it could have been 100 feet. But I got snagged on something that I thought was a big fish, but it felt too solid, and I couldn't get it up. Whatever I hooked was moving at an incredibly steady pace away from us, pretty slowly too. No thrashing, no give, just like I hooked an underwater conveyor belt that wouldn't stop for anything. Eventually, we had to slash the line to keep the entire spool from being unreeled, but no one had any clue what it was. Either some crazy underwater floating debris, or possibly, because there's a submarine manufacturer nearby, I got stuck on a submarine lull. It was so weird, and I'd call the unknown factor eerie. The one I heard from a friend a long time ago. It happened in the 1970s, I believe. Not on the sea, but on a river in a secluded area. They were kayaking, a group of people, in the evening. Suddenly, the river around them started to glow with many lights underwater. It was a mystery for them for many years. Until one day, years later, my friend heard the story from another perspective on the radio. A group of filmmakers had been tasked to film underwater life. Maybe it was nocturnal underwater life. I can't remember now. They mentioned where it was filmed and that they had to test the lighting they installed. The group of kayaking friends had just happened to be in the right place at the right time. As it was evening, they didn't see anyone. And after many years, the mystery was finally solved. Not me, but my brother is an avid sailor. He has done numerous open ocean crossings, sailed to the Galapagos, etc. He was on night watch one night when a large container ship made contact with him, just verifying each other's course and speed to avoid collision. The container ship also checked in to ensure they were okay and didn't need any assistance. They then asked my brother if they were sailing with another boat, as the ship's radar showed 2 boats similar in size, one being the boat my brother was on, and another about 2 miles behind him, matching course and speed. Neither my brother nor the container ship could make visual contact with the other vessel. The container ship even said it wasn't likely a radar shadow, as they tend to be very close to each other. My brother said it helped him stay awake that night. Late 90s, USN. Our ship was trying to dodge twin typhoons by steering north of them. Weather reports were 2 days old, and we slammed right into the hurricanes. We were taking on water. All non-essential work was halted, and we were told to batten down the hatches. I had duty in the chief's mess hall on the third deck, which was normally above sea level, but waves were pouring in under the cargo doors. The chiefs were concerned that the ship could come apart if the waves got any higher and capsized us. Not quite a prayer. I sat down on my break in the loading dock and worried, would we be okay? Suddenly, a vision of the ship from the outside, as if I was in front of the forward bow, came to me. It was being tossed in the waves, but a golden glow appeared around the bow. That glow coalesced into two great wings that held the bow, like two giant cupped hands. It was then that I knew the ship would be all right. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. Please like and subscribe if you'd like to see more. Behind the Veil.